Hello world and welcome to Web Dev Frontiers. My name is Tamas and I'm here to share my experience with you in web technologies. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how to use the network panel inside Chrome DevTools. And I'm going to be sharing a couple of features of this network panel with you that I'm hoping that you have not heard about, but you will definitely use this in your web development workflow. If you're ready, let's jump straight in. All right, I already have my DevTools panel open and I've navigated to the network panel. And as you can see, I already loaded the website and I have a bunch of network requests in here. But first, let me give you a real quick overview of the interface that you see for the network panel. And I'm going to start by what I think is the most important advice. If you're doing a lot of development and if you're using DevTools quite frequently, I recommend that you check the disable cache checkbox and you leave that as sort of your default setting. And the reason for this is because every time you make a change in your web application, you want to make sure while you're developing that all the requests will go out again and the browser will not cache any of the resources so that you will see the most up-to-date version of the page. I have had situations before where I did not have this checkbox checked and I did a change on the page, I refreshed the page in the browser and the browser didn't pick up that I've changed a CSS file or I've done some sort of a change. So if you want to make sure that you always get the latest assets for your particular website, just make sure that this disable cache button is enabled. All right, so what are these things here? There's so many things that we can do in the network panel. So as I said, let's go through the interface first. So in the very top, you can basically clear all the requests. You can do some filtering, you can do a search, you can have preserve log, which basically that means that the requests that you see in this table view will not be deleted if you refresh the page. Then you can do network throttling, then you can have some additional network conditions and also import and export HAR files, amongst other things. So where should we start with this? Well, let's actually go through throttling because I think that could be a common thing that you would be using. So if you select one of the presets and you refresh the page, then basically what you're saying is that please load this site using the fast 3G connection. Now, as you can see, there's fast 3G, slow 3G, and offline. Offline is pretty much relevant for situations when you're creating a progressive web application, which is supposed to work offline as well. But let's say you would like to know how fast or how slow your website loads on an LTE connection. But notice there's no LTE preset here, but you can of course click on add and you can add your custom profile and we could name this LTE. And I think the download speed is, we can enter whatever it is. I think it's about 12 megabytes. And then the upload speed, let's say that's 5 megabytes for LTE. I'm not sure if I actually added those numbers right, but you get the idea. You click add and then you close this panel and now you have access to the LTE throttling connection as well. Now if you notice next to the throttling options, there's another little icon that says more network conditions. So if I click on that, I get access to this bottom section where I can actually view additional network condition settings, such as whether the browser should be using its own default user agent or a different one. Now, for example, I could uncheck this and I could add a custom user agent, or I could select one from the pre-select list. So I could request my page pretending to be a Safari iPhone iOS 13.2. And this is the user agent string that Chrome would then send. This could be useful for testing scenarios for how the website would look like on a mobile connection. And we can also change the content encoding settings. So I can use deflate, gzip, and broadly encoding. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later because I would like to show you something really cool about this. But this is just FYI. So let's go back to using the browser default and just close this section completely. Let's talk about the result, which is the bulk of the information that is being presented here in the network panel. So as you can see, I have a bunch of requests for my own website, and notice there are some filter buttons here: all, doc, JS, fetch, XHR, CSS, so on and so forth. And because I'm showing all, it means that all the requests that this particular page made are now visible. which is great, but let's say that you would only like to see the outgoing JavaScript requests. So all you need to do is click the JavaScript button, and then all you see are the JavaScript requests. But do notice that there's something here called detect Angular for extension, Web Vitals, on each interaction. These are scripts that come from Chrome extensions that I have enabled for my browser. And probably you don't want to see this because it gets a little bit confusing. Luckily, in the latest versions of Chrome, you can actually check the hide extension URLs checkbox here, and that is automatically going to get rid of all the JavaScript that is not coming from your site. So all the JavaScript that would be loaded by various Chrome extensions. I like to use this as a default as well, by the way, may I add. All right, so let's go back to all the requests. And as you can see, by default, the table contains a name, status, type, initiator, size, time, and waterfall columns, and it is ordered by waterfall. So waterfall basically is the waterfall for the requests. And of course, the first request is going to be the main page, then we requested a CSS, so on and so forth. But if you'd like to have more information, all you need to do is right click somewhere in the header section, and now you can enable any of these particular column values. So for example, we could utilize the protocol. We could also select and use the priority. And these are the two that I like to have in there for various reasons. So the protocol would basically tell us if we are using HTTP 1, HTTP 2, or as you can see, HTTP 3 as well. And then the priority column would actually tell me the priorities of the resources according to the browser. This has some importance for web performance reasons, and maybe I'll cover that in a future video, but I just like to have that there. Now, interesting enough, we can actually add a custom column header value to this table as well. So let me go to another website because I would like to demonstrate that to you right here. So let's refresh the page. As you can see, there are a bunch of requests in here. And what I'm going to do now is click into one of these requests, and we get information about the headers. Okay, so we get the general headers, we get the response headers, and of course we get the request headers. And do notice that I get this custom header called X Vercel ID. So this particular site is deployed on Vercel, and the Vercel ID is going to tell me from which data center this particular site was served from. And SYN 1, even though it sounds like a SYN, it's not, it's the Singapore 1 data center. Now, what if I would like to have this information available in the column so that for every Vercel request that I have, I would have this particular ID listed because maybe I want to debug something, or I just want to have that information visible and right in front of me so that I could use it somewhere. Okay, so let's remember this is X Vercel ID. So all we need to do now is right click again here in any of the column headers and go to response headers and click manage header columns. And in here, I can add a custom header, which is going to add X Vercel ID, click add. And now when we go back to the network request, we now have the X Vercel ID listed there as well. And you can do this for any of the response headers that you have in your application. And I find this really, really cool and really, really useful. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about the initiator column. So remember in a previous video, which I'm going to link in the description, and you should see a card appearing at the video, I talked about the fact that you can press the shift key and hover your mouse over the various request items. Anything that appears in red was requested by whatever you have highlighted, and anything that's green was the requester for the thing that you have highlighted. And that exact same thing is also available inside the initiator column. So for example, we can see that the font files were initiated by app.css, and app.css was initiated by my index.html file in line number 7. Furthermore, if I click into any of these requests, apart from the headers, I get some additional information here. So I can preview the particular request. And for the CSS, I of course see the CSS. I get the response, which is going to be exactly the same. And then notice the next option that I have is the initiator. And this is the initiation chain. So The CSS file, which you can see in bold, was requested by essentially index.html, and in turn, app.css made a request to 5 different fonts. And then the last thing that I will show you as well is timings. This is basically the time and duration for this particular resource it took to arrive to the page. And this was 17 milliseconds. And this could be useful for situations when a request is being delayed, because then you would see, the stalled section to be really long, and you could do some further optimization in that. But this is getting more into the realms of web performance again. Notice that we also have a cogwheel icon here. Do not confuse that with the cogwheel icon just above that, because that would bring up the overall settings for DevTools, but this cogwheel would bring up the settings only for the network panel. And notice that I could have things like screenshots, group by frame, and big request rows, as well as overview. So the overview section is enabled by default, and this is it. Basically, it allows you to sort of drag and drop a section of this particular chart and then only display the elements that got loaded in that section. So for example, I could go from 1000 milliseconds to 2000 milliseconds, and I could see only the resources that were loaded in that period of time. And notice that this green and blue colors that you see here are directly related to the waterfalls. And then of course, now I could go into any of these, and the green color represents the time that the browser had to wait for the server's response. And then the blue color indicates the time it took for the browser to download this particular content. Okay, so you can just explore this if you want. Now, what are these other things? So let's actually click on screenshots, and we need to refresh our application to see what screenshots is going to do, but essentially it's going to capture a film strip, and here it is. If you want to zoom into it, you need to double click that, and now you get these arrows which will kind of show you how your site changed over the time. Okay, so notice that between 334 milliseconds and 350 milliseconds, my graphic appeared in the top of the page. Okay, and you can just have a little walkthrough of the site, how the page loads, and just monitor when particular elements or sections appear and at what timestamps. Now let's also talk about the big request rows. So big request rows is basically going to make the table here below a little bit larger, and it's going to provide us with more information. So now if I do a refresh just to get all these items, you will see that if a particular resource came in from an additional domain, we will see that appearing here as well. We will get not only the status code, but the status message as well. So HTTP 200 is of course okay. We are going to be getting locations, for example. So the fonts that I have would come from the fonts folder in this case. And what's really interesting is the size. And this question comes up when you look at the bottom section as well. So the bottom section here basically says there are 10 out of 13 requests, 141 kilobytes out of 184 kilobytes transferred, and the resource sizes are different again because it is now 357 out of 369. The whole page finished loading in 5.16 seconds, and then you get the DOM content loaded value as well. And maybe I think there's another value which we can't see because I'm zoomed in a lot, but there you go, load is 135 milliseconds. But let's just take a look at this one single entry here. You see that there are two sizes. One is 5.4 kilobytes, the other one is 19.9 kilobytes. So is the page 5.4 kilobytes or is it 19 kilobytes? Same is true for the CSS file. Is it 5.3 kilobytes or is it 26.6 kilobytes? So I really like this view because it gives you two things. First of all, the 5.4 kilobytes is the size of the resource compressed, but the real resource size is 19.9 kilobytes. And the explanation that you get here when you hover your mouse over this says 5.4 kilobytes transferred over the network, and the resource size is 19.9 kilobytes. But the easy way to think about this is that the value that you see first is the compressed value that was sent over the network, and the resource size, which is basically the uncompressed size, is about 20 kilobytes. Now, there are situations when there's only 1 kilobyte difference. For example, images are not going to be compressed by the browser. There's no gzip or Brotli compression for them. The question is, why is there a difference between what has been transferred over the network and the resource size? And in this case, the difference is insignificant, but still they are not the same number. And so the transferred over network size essentially contains the HTTP headers as well. So it contains HTTP header information, whereas the resource size is just the size of the resource without any additional headers. So that's just the raw size of the resource. Okay, so that's a significant difference. Now, remember we had this particular view where we had the more network conditions option. And remember we had this accepted content encodings checkbox. So let's actually uncheck everything here. And let's refresh the page and see what happens. Now, if I refresh the page, notice that the resource numbers that have been transferred over the network and the content size are more close to each other. Essentially, I have now disabled the browser's capability to accept compressed files, and now the server is sending the full-blown files without compression. But again, the difference between 20.2 kilobytes and 19.9 kilobytes comes from the fact that the resource that got transferred over contains the additional HTTP headers as well. There are two more things that I would like to show you in terms of what you can do with the network panel in Chrome DevTools. And let's talk about this filter input box because we haven't talked a lot about this. Notice that I've loaded another website and I get a lot of requests here. And we could use this filter input box to actually filter out results. I could do a very simple filter and I could just type in home, and that would basically bring up all the requests where the term home appears in one way or another. But this particular input box for filtering allows us to enter more complex expressions. In fact, it has its own sort of query language, if you will. So for example, I could type in something like MIME type, and as you can see, it will autocomplete, and then it will also autocomplete with all the potential MIME types that I can select. So I could just say, show me all the AVIF images, and now the result in the bottom only shows where the type is AVIF. Furthermore, I can take this to the next level and I could type something in like larger than, and I could type in something like larger than, say 10K, for example, or I could do, let's go 100K, for example. So these are the two AVIF images that are larger than 100 kilobytes. And you can play around with this. I'm going to put a link on the screen where you can learn more about the query language that you can use inside this filter box. The very last example that I would like to show you is related to the fact that you can now overwrite response headers using Chrome DevTools and using the network panel, which essentially means that you can do a lot of things locally, and you can do a lot of tests and a lot of interesting scenarios just by modifying the headers. So let me show you two potentially very useful scenarios right now. So as you can see here, we have an application running on localhost, and I get a message that says could not load fruits and could not load vegetables. And if we look closer, the way this application is put together is that I have the UI running on localhost 8080, but the APIs are on localhost 3000. So there are two endpoints, /API/fruits.json and /API/vegetables.json. And if I open up my console, it's pretty clear the reason why this application doesn't work is because of course. And we do not have the access control allow origin header set. And if we don't have access to the backend, then this could lead to a problem because we won't be able to test our application. So we're going to pretend that we do not have access to the backend. So let's see what we can do locally to actually load the fruit and the vegetables in this application. So let me close the console here. And also inside the network panel, notice that we have two red entries blocked because of a course request. And they're all coming from the JavaScript file that I mentioned. Now what we can do, we can click to this request, go to headers, and notice inside the response headers section, if you hover your mouse over any of these, you get a little pencil icon. It doesn't matter which one you click because that's just going to bring up an override header section for us. So I'm just going to click right here. And we need to make sure that we select a local folder because, as I said, these changes can only be done locally by Chrome DevTools. So we're going to select a folder, just go into any folder on your machine, click select, and then just make sure that you allow this security warning by Chrome as well. And now you are ready to override some of these headers or add new headers. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to click add header, and the header name is going to be access control allow origin, and the header value is just going to be asterisk. Okay, so I'm just going to hit enter, and notice at this point in time we now get an exclamation mark here indicating that we're going to be locally overwriting some of these requests. So let's refresh the page and look at that. We now load the fruits. Also notice that inside the network panel, you get this little purple icon indicating that this particular request has some locally overwritten header values. And it's always going to be pointed out to you very clearly in green. But of course, vegetables doesn't work. Now we could go in here, do exactly the same, or there's a much better solution that we could do. We could click on this .headers link right here, which will bring up the header definitions. And as opposed to applying the custom header of access control allow origin to fruits.json, we could override this and just type in asterisk.json. Hit enter, that is going to save this local override rule, refresh the page, and now we get all the data returned in our application. If you no longer wish to override these particular headers, all you need to do is make sure that you uncheck this box. You could also clear this, and now if you refresh the page, you will get the error again because we are no longer overwriting the custom headers. Well, that's it. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you have learned something about the network panel in Chrome DevTools. If I've missed something, or if you know a very cool trick, or you would like to learn more about some of these features, either in the network panel or in DevTools, please let me know via the comment section. Otherwise, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And of course, I would love for you to subscribe for the channel for more such content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.